Ethan Johnson sat behind the large, imposing desk in his Manhattan penthouse office, casually scrolling through a list of potential business investments. Tall, with meticulously groomed dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a sharp, tailored suit that screamed wealth, he was every bit the self-made millionaire the media portrayed him to be. At 35, Ethan had built a business empire from scratch, transforming a small tech startup into one of the largest corporations in New York. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success, young, rich, and undeniably attractive. But to those who truly knew him, Ethan was something else: arrogant, fiercely competitive, and unapologetically ruthless. Ethan's life revolved around winning, and he loved the feeling of always being one step ahead of everyone else. In business, he crushed competitors without a second thought, and in his personal life, his relationships followed a similar pattern. Women flocked to him, drawn by his wealth, charm, and good looks, but his tastes were painfully specific. His girlfriends were always tall, thin, and conventionally beautiful, with flawless skin, perfect bodies, and the willingness to play by his rules. To Ethan, relationships were just another game to win, a way to showcase his dominance. He had no time for vulnerability or emotional attachments. Love, as far as he was concerned, was for the weak. Ethan valued power, control, and appearance above all else. You know what they say, right? He'd tell his friends at their lavish parties. There's no point in settling for anything less than perfection, and his friends, equally wealthy and competitive, would laugh and agree. His penthouse was a reflection of that mentality: sleek, modern, and filled with expensive artwork. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the New York skyline, but it was cold, almost sterile, devoid of personal touches or warmth. It was, in every way, a symbol of Ethan's life, impressive from a distance, but lacking real substance beneath the surface. For Ethan, there was no such thing as losing. Until now, life had been a constant series of victories, both in the boardroom and the bedroom. But things were about to change, dramatically, and Ethan had no idea just how unprepared he was for what lay ahead. It was a warm summer evening in New York City, and Ethan found himself at yet another elite gathering, this time at the rooftop bar of a five-star hotel. The place was packed with Manhattan's finest, the rich, the beautiful, and the powerful. Ethan leaned casually against the marble counter, sipping his whiskey while engaging in light conversation with Ryan, his oldest friend and occasional business rival. Ryan, always the more easygoing of the two, had a smirk on his face as he spoke. "Ethan, you're predictable, man. I could probably describe your next girlfriend without even seeing her. Tall, blonde, thin, and just dying to impress you." Ethan chuckled, unfazed. "If you've got high standards, you stick to them. What can I say? I don't settle." Ryan's smirk grew wider, and Ethan sensed a challenge in the air. "That's the problem with you, Ethan. You treat everything like a transaction, even relationships. But let's see how you handle something different." Intrigued, Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Ryan took a sip of his drink, his eyes glinting with mischief. "I bet you $1 million that you couldn't last 6 months married to a woman who doesn't fit your standards. You know, someone who isn't trying to win your approval or meet your checklist." Ethan scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Please, you really think $1 million is enough motivation for me to waste 6 months of my life?" Ryan leaned in, his voice low but firm. "That's the thing, Ethan. You're so used to winning. I wonder if you'd even recognize a real challenge if it stared you in the face." Ethan stared back at Ryan, his pride pricked. "You're on," he said, unable to resist the lure of competition. For Ethan, it wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about proving he could conquer anything, even a relationship that didn't fit into his carefully crafted world. Ryan grinned, satisfied. "All right then, let's make it interesting. Her name is Angela Davis. She's a friend of my wife's. You'll meet her tomorrow. She's nothing like the women you're used to, Ethan. She's confident, strong, and doesn't care about your money or your looks. If you can stay married to her for 6 months without calling it quits, I'll wire you the $1 million. Ethan, ever the strategist, barely blinked. "Easy," But as Ryan clinked his glass against Ethan's, something in his friend's expression made Ethan pause. Ryan knew something he didn't, but Ethan, in his arrogance, dismissed it. It was just another game. Another victory waiting to be claimed. Or so he thought. The following evening, Ethan arrived at a chic restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, a place known for its exclusivity and quiet luxury. He was used to the atmosphere, the soft lighting, the impeccable service, and the clientele dressed in designer clothes. What he wasn't used to, however, was the woman he was about to meet. Angela Davis walked into the restaurant with her head held high. She was a striking figure, not because she fit any typical beauty standards, but because of the way she carried herself. She was a woman who knew who she was and didn't care to impress anyone. Angela was in her early 30s, with deep brown skin, natural curls that framed her face, and a full figure that radiated confidence. She wasn't the type of woman who would ever be intimidated by someone like Ethan Johnson, no matter how wealthy or powerful he was. As she approached the table where Ethan was seated, she could feel his eyes scanning her. She had been briefed on who he was, a man known for his arrogance and his obsession with physical perfection. Angela smiled to herself. This would be interesting. Ethan, right? She said, extending her hand as she sat down. Ethan stood up, surprised by her directness. Yes, and you must be Angela. She didn't wait for him to pull out her chair or make small talk. She was here on her own terms. I know why I'm here, she said, her voice calm but firm. Ryan's little game. He told me everything. Ethan was taken aback. He did. Angela nodded, unfazed. Let's skip the pretense. I know this is about a bet. You need to stay married to me for 6 months to win $1 million. Sound right? Ethan chuckled, more out of discomfort than amusement. Well, I guess that sums it up. Angela leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes locking with his. Let me make one thing clear, Ethan. I'm not here to play along with your game. I'm not one of your business deals, and I certainly don't care about your money. You're going to have to do more than flash a bank account to impress me. Ethan, momentarily thrown off balance, gave a tight smile. I didn't expect anything less, but inside, he was rattled. Angela was unlike any woman he had ever encountered. There was no hesitation, no attempt to please or impress him. She was completely herself, and that made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. They continued their meal, and while the conversation was civil, the tension between them was palpable. Angela was polite, but there was an edge to her words that Ethan wasn't used to. She didn't laugh at his jokes or shower him with compliments. Instead, she challenged him, questioned him, and didn't shy away from pointing out the flaws in his thinking. By the end of the evening, Ethan felt more frustrated than victorious. He had walked into the restaurant thinking this would be just another transaction, another situation he could easily control. But Angela had made it clear. She was not going to be controlled, and this was not going to be easy. As he watched her leave, he couldn't help but wonder. Had he just underestimated the challenge? The first official date between Ethan and Angela was arranged a few days later. Ethan, determined to maintain control, picked one of his usual high-end haunts, a French restaurant known for its Michelin-starred cuisine and extravagant decor. It was the kind of place that screamed wealth, with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and a menu that didn't list prices. Ethan arrived first, feeling a sense of familiarity and confidence. He knew this world inside out. He was used to women being impressed by the luxury and sophistication. Tonight, he assumed, would be no different. Angela, however, wasn't the type to be fazed by shiny distractions. She walked into the restaurant dressed in a simple, elegant black dress. She wasn't trying to fit in or stand out. She was just being herself. As she approached the table, Ethan stood to greet her, but the tension between them was palpable from the start. Ethan gestured to the lavish surroundings. I thought you'd like this place, he said smoothly, expecting the usual compliments on his impeccable taste. Angela glanced around, unimpressed. It's nice, but I'm more of a hole-in-the-wall, local spot kind of woman. Ethan blinked. That wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. I'll keep that in mind for next time, he said, attempting to recover his footing. The conversation started off stilted, with Ethan trying to lead it in the direction he was used to. Superficial small talk about travel, business, and luxury. But Angela wasn't interested in that. She cut through his practiced charm with directness. "So, how do you feel about this whole situation?" Angela asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You know, this bet. Are you here because you actually think there's something worthwhile in getting to know me? Or is this just another competition for you?" Ethan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I'm a competitive guy. I won't lie. But I'm curious about you." Angela nodded slowly. "Curious, huh? Do you usually try to win people?" Ethan's smirk faltered. This wasn't how his dates typically went. He was used to women laughing at his comments, agreeing with his views, and being impressed by his wealth. But Angela wasn't playing along. She was calling him out, challenging him to be honest in a way no one ever had before. "I don't see people as things to win," he said carefully, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. His life was about winning, whether in business or relationships. But Angela's question made him uncomfortable in a way he didn't like to admit. Angela watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." The rest of the evening continued in the same vein. Ethan, ever the charmer, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but Angela wouldn't let him. She pushed him, asking real questions about his values, his life, and why he believed what he did. It wasn't what Ethan expected. He felt off balance, as if Angela could see right through the persona he had spent years crafting. By the time dessert arrived, Ethan was no longer in control of the evening. He was used to commanding attention, to being the center of conversation, but Angela had turned the tables on him. She wasn't interested in his money, his status, or his power. She wanted authenticity, and that was something Ethan hadn't offered anyone in years. As they left the restaurant, Ethan couldn't help but feel unsettled. Angela had gotten under his skin, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. This was supposed to be easy, a simple 6-month bet, but it was already becoming more complicated than he had ever imagined. Angela smiled as they parted ways. "Good night, Ethan. Maybe next time, we can go to a place where you don't feel so comfortable." Ethan stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the night. For the first time in years, he had no clever response. As the weeks went on, Ethan found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had always prided himself on being in control, whether it was in business or personal relationships. But with Angela, things weren't going according to plan. Each time they met, she challenged him in ways that made him feel vulnerable, exposed. It wasn't just her confidence that unsettled him, but her complete lack of interest in playing by his rules. She didn't care about his wealth, his status, or the lifestyle he had crafted around those things. And for the first time, Ethan felt as though he was the one being pursued, not the pursuer. It started with small moments. On their third date, Ethan took her to a high-end art gallery opening, the kind of event where everyone wore designer clothes and discussed investments in fine art as casually as they talked about weekend plans. He was used to these environments, where he could walk into a room and instantly command attention. But Angela, as always, was different. While others marveled at the sculptures and expensive paintings, Angela made an offhand comment that completely threw him. "You ever notice how these places feel more like auctions than galleries?" she said, eyeing a multi-million-dollar painting. "It's less about appreciating the art and more about showing off who can spend the most." Ethan blinked. "That's part of it, I guess. Art is an investment." Angela shook her head with a small laugh. "That's not what art should be. It's supposed to make you feel something, not just line your pockets." Ethan found himself at a loss for words. He had always viewed art, and most things in life, as another asset, another marker of success. But Angela's perspective was disarmingly different. It wasn't that she was trying to challenge him just for the sake of it. She genuinely saw the world in a way that Ethan wasn't used to. Later that evening, when they were having drinks on the terrace of his penthouse, Ethan attempted to regain some control of the situation. He poured them both a glass of wine and leaned in, turning on his usual charm. "You know, Angela," he said smoothly, "I don't meet many people who can stand toe-to-toe with me like you do. Most people try to fit into my world." Angela raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's because you've surrounded yourself with people who are afraid to challenge you." "But life isn't about winning all the time, Ethan." He chuckled, trying to brush it off. I'd argue that's exactly what it's about. But Angela didn't laugh. Instead, she fixed him with a steady gaze. And what do you lose in the process? What happens when you're always trying to win but never really living? For a moment, the question hung between them. Ethan's usual smooth responses failed him. No one had ever asked him that before. It was as though Angela had tapped into something deeper, something he didn't want to admit, even to himself. That night, after she left, Ethan sat alone in his luxurious penthouse, staring out at the city skyline. Normally, he would feel a sense of satisfaction. Another successful date, another step closer to winning the bet. But instead, he felt something he couldn't quite name. It gnawed at him, a sense of unease, of losing control. The more time he spent with Angela, the more he realized that she wasn't just a challenge. She was a mirror, reflecting parts of himself that he had long buried. His constant need for control, his obsession with image, his refusal to let anyone get too close. It was all starting to crumble. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure if he could maintain the upper hand. He had entered into this bet thinking it would be just another game to win. But now, with Angela, he was starting to question whether he even wanted to win at all. Ethan found himself thinking about Angela more often than he cared to admit. What began as an attempt to outsmart a bet had turned into something far more complex. The more time they spent together, the more she revealed layers of herself that intrigued him. She was confident, but not in the way that people in his world were. Angela didn't rely on material success to define her worth. Her confidence came from a deep understanding of who she was, what she valued, and what she wanted out of life. Ethan had never met anyone like her. During one of their conversations over coffee, they talked about their childhoods. It was a topic Ethan rarely touched upon with anyone. He had always preferred to keep his past private, a mystery even to those closest to him. But with Angela, things felt different. I grew up in the Bronx, Angela said, sipping her coffee. Not the easiest place to be, but it taught me a lot. I learned to stand my ground early. There's no room for being timid where I'm from. Ethan nodded, trying to connect. I grew up in a small town in Connecticut. My family wasn't wealthy, but my father always pushed me to be the best. It was all about making something of myself. Angela smiled, but it wasn't a patronizing smile. It was one of understanding. And you did. You've built an empire. Yeah, but I wonder sometimes, Ethan said, almost without thinking, if I'm just repeating what I saw growing up. Success, winning, always being on top. It's exhausting. Angela raised her eyebrows, clearly surprised by his admission. So why keep doing it? Ethan hesitated. Because I don't know how to stop. Angela looked at him thoughtfully, and for a moment, the silence between them was charged with something unsaid. You don't always have to be in control, Ethan, she said softly. Sometimes the best things happen when you let go a little. Her words hit him harder than they should have. It wasn't just about control. For Ethan, letting go meant vulnerability, something he had avoided for as long as he could remember. Vulnerability meant risking failure, and failure wasn't an option for him. But Angela was showing him that there was another way to look at the world, one where winning didn't always mean being on top. As the weeks went on, Ethan found himself admiring Angela for more than just her confidence. She was smart, witty, and unapologetically herself. She had opinions about everything, from politics to art to relationships, and she wasn't afraid to voice them. But what Ethan admired most was that she never tried to change him. She challenged him. Sure, but she wasn't looking to mold him into something he wasn't. She accepted him for who he was, flaws and all. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Ethan invited Angela over to his place for a quiet dinner. They sat on his balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. For once, Ethan didn't feel the need to impress her. He didn't pull out the expensive wine or hire a private chef. He cooked a simple pasta dish, and they ate together in comfortable silence. I have to admit, Ethan said, breaking the silence, you're not what I expected. Angela laughed, her eyes glinting in the soft glow of the city. I could say the same about you. Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking at her with something close to admiration. You've made me rethink a lot of things. I thought I had everything figured out. But you see the world differently. Angela shrugged. Maybe you've just been looking at it through a narrow lens. There's more to life than winning, Ethan. Sometimes it's about what you gain when you stop trying so hard to control everything. For the first time, Ethan found himself considering her words seriously. Could there be more to life than his relentless pursuit of success? He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Angela wasn't just another woman in his life. She was someone who was changing him, bit by bit, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what that meant. As their relationship continued to develop, Ethan found the dynamic between him and Angela shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had once been a competition, a bet he was determined to win, had evolved into something much more complex. He was no longer trying to manipulate or control the situation. Instead, he was being drawn into something deeper, something real, and that terrified him. The change became most apparent one evening when they were out for dinner at a small, cozy restaurant in Brooklyn. It was nothing like the fancy places Ethan usually took dates. There were no white tablecloths, no valet parking, just good food and a relaxed atmosphere. Angela had picked the spot, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt at ease in a setting that wasn't about status or money. As they sat together, the conversation flowed naturally. They talked about everything: work, family, even their past relationships. Angela was open about her experiences, and in return, Ethan found himself sharing parts of his life he rarely discussed. He told her about the pressure he had always felt to succeed, how his father had instilled in him the belief that failure was never an option. "My dad used to say, in this world, if you're not winning, you're losing," Ethan said, swirling his glass of wine. "I guess I've lived by that ever since." Angela looked at him with a softness he wasn't used to. "But that's a lot of pressure to carry, isn't it? Constantly having to win?" Ethan sighed, feeling a weight lift slightly as he spoke the truth out loud. "Yeah, it is. But it's all I know." Angela reached across the table and placed her hand gently on his. "You don't have to carry that burden alone, Ethan. You don't always have to be on top. Sometimes, letting someone else in, letting someone help you, isn't a sign of weakness. It's strength." Her words struck something deep inside him. He had never thought of vulnerability as a strength. To him, it had always been something to avoid, something that made you lose control. But with Angela, things were different. He trusted her, in a way he hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. The moment wasn't just emotional, it was transformative. Ethan realized that he didn't have to perform for her. He didn't have to be the Ethan Johnson everyone else expected, the powerful, wealthy, untouchable businessman. With Angela, he could just be himself, and for the first time, that felt like enough. As the evening went on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the undercurrent of connection remained strong. They laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't thinking about winning. He wasn't strategizing or planning his next move. He was simply enjoying the moment, enjoying being with her. After dinner, they walked along the quiet streets of Brooklyn, the summer air warm and still. Angela linked her arm through Ethan's, and they strolled in comfortable silence. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar: peace. As they neared her apartment, Angela turned to him with a small smile. "Tonight was nice. You didn't feel the need to impress me with anything flashy." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe I'm learning." "Maybe you are," she said softly, looking up at him. "But it's not about changing who you are, Ethan. It's about realizing that you don't have to play a role all the time. You're allowed to just be." That night, as he walked back to his car, Ethan felt the full weight of what was happening. His relationship with Angela had moved beyond the confines of the bet. It was no longer about proving something to Ryan, or to himself. It was about something real, something genuine. Ethan was falling for her, and that terrified him because for the first time, he wasn't in control, and he didn't want to be. As the 6-month mark of the bet loomed closer, Ethan found himself in a state of inner turmoil. What had started as a game, a challenge to prove to Ryan and himself that he could win even in relationships, had turned into something much more profound. His feelings for Angela were real, undeniable, and they terrified him. For the first time in years, Ethan was grappling with emotions he couldn't easily categorize or control. Sitting in his penthouse one evening, Ethan stared out at the Manhattan skyline, the city lights flickering below. The silence in his luxurious apartment felt heavier than usual. His mind wandered back to every moment he had shared with Angela, every conversation that had stripped away the layers of his carefully constructed persona. She had gotten under his skin in a way no one else ever had. She saw through his defenses, his arrogance, and his obsession with winning. She didn't care about his money or his power. She cared about him, and that was what unsettled him the most. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his messages, pausing at the last one from Ryan. "Almost time for you to collect, buddy. 6 months, $1 million. Easy win, right?" Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. The bet. He had almost forgotten about it, lost in the reality of his growing feelings for Angela. How could he have been so foolish? He had entered this relationship for all the wrong reasons, and now, standing at the precipice of the bet's conclusion, he realized he didn't care about the money anymore. He cared about Angela, but how could he ever tell her the truth? The thought of confessing the bet to Angela haunted him. He imagined the hurt in her eyes, the betrayal she would feel if she knew that their relationship had begun as nothing more than a cynical wager. Ethan could barely stomach the thought. He was trapped between his pride and the depth of the feelings he had for her. Would she ever forgive him if she knew? Angela had begun to change him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just a challenge or a novelty. She was someone who had forced him to confront parts of himself that he had long buried. The more time he spent with her, the more he questioned the life he had built. Was this endless pursuit of success and control really what he wanted? Or had he been hiding behind it to avoid the vulnerability that real connections required? One night, over dinner at her apartment, a modest, warm space filled with art and books that reflected her personality, Angela sensed that something was off. Ethan was quieter than usual, lost in thought, and she could feel the tension radiating from him. "What's going on, Ethan?" she asked, setting her fork down and leaning forward, concern etched on her face. "You've been distant these past few days. You know you can talk to me, right?" Ethan met her gaze, his chest tightening. The weight of the truth pressed down on him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he forced a smile. "It's just work. It's been a lot lately." Angela studied him for a moment, clearly not convinced, but she didn't press further. "Well, you don't have to carry it all by yourself, you know. I'm here." Her kindness, her willingness to be there for him even when he wasn't being fully honest, only deepened his guilt. How could he ever deserve someone like her? How could he continue this relationship, knowing the secret that hung between them? As Ethan left her apartment that night, the conflict inside him raged. The 6 months were almost up, and soon the truth would have to come out, one way or another. He had two choices: confess everything and risk losing Angela, or continue the lie and collect his prize. But the thought of winning the bet now felt hollow, meaningless. What was $1 million compared to what he had found with her? For the first time in his life, Ethan was faced with a choice that wasn't about winning or losing. It was about doing the right thing, and he wasn't sure if he had the courage to make the right call. The end of the 6 months arrived faster than Ethan had anticipated. Each passing day felt like a countdown, not to his victory, but to a moment of reckoning. The looming bet, once something he had viewed as a simple game, now weighed on him like a burden. The stakes had changed dramatically. This wasn't about the $1 million anymore. It was about Angela and the growing certainty that he had fallen for her. But how could he explain that their relationship had started as a wager? On the morning of the final day, Ethan stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows in his penthouse, watching the city bustle far below. His phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. "Congratulations, man. Time to cash in. Drinks to celebrate?" Ethan felt a pit in his stomach. He had won the bet. On paper, he should be celebrating. 6 months married to Angela, just as agreed. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the beginning of an unraveling. He hadn't told her yet. He had tried on several occasions, but every time he opened his mouth to speak, the words died on his lips. He couldn't bear to see the look of betrayal in her eyes. Later that evening, Angela invited him over for dinner, completely unaware of the significance of the date. She had made one of her favorite dishes, something simple but filled with flavor and love, a reflection of who she was. Ethan could hardly focus on the meal. His thoughts were consumed by what he had to do, what he had to confess. Midway through dinner, as Angela laughed at something he said, the guilt became unbearable. Ethan put down his fork, his palms sweaty, heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't wait any longer. "Angela, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice strained. Angela immediately sensed the seriousness in his tone, and her laughter faded. "What is it?" she asked, her smile slipping into concern. Ethan took a deep breath, the words sticking in his throat. I wasn't honest with you when we first met." Angela's brow furrowed, but she remained calm. "What do you mean?" He could barely look at her. "There was a bet. Ryan and I. He bet me $1 million that I couldn't stay married to someone who didn't fit my usual type for 6 months. There. It was out." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Angela's face went blank, her expression impossible to read. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to make sense of what she had just heard. "So all of this was a game to you?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a sharp edge to it. "No," Ethan said quickly, desperate to explain. "It started that way, yes, but it's not anymore. Angela, I swear, this isn't about the bet anymore. He struggled to find the right words, but everything sounded hollow and wrong. "I fell in love with you." Angela stood up from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She turned away from him, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from the hurt that was crashing down on her. Ethan stood too, reaching for her, but she pulled back. "I trusted you, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and pain. "I let you in, and the whole time, you were just playing me? For some stupid bet?" "It wasn't like that," Ethan pleaded. "Not after I got to know you. I didn't care about the bet anymore. I just didn't know how to tell you." Angela turned to face him, tears welling up in her eyes. "But you didn't. You let this go on for 6 months without telling me. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" Ethan felt the walls closing in around him. He had never felt so powerless, so helpless. This was the moment he had been dreading, and it was worse than he had imagined. "Angela, please. I know I messed up, but I love you. I don't care about the money or the bet. I care about you." Angela shook her head, her tears falling now. "Love? You think this is love? Love isn't about lies and manipulation, Ethan. You can't just say you love me and expect that to fix everything." She stepped back, wiping her eyes. "I need time," she said quietly. "I need to think. I don't even know if I can believe you anymore." Ethan's heart shattered as he watched her walk away, disappearing into the other room, leaving him standing alone in the wreckage of what could have been. In the days that followed, Ethan's world felt like it was falling apart. Angela had asked for space, and Ethan, realizing he had no right to push her, respected her wishes. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a man who had always prided himself on being in control, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He had never felt so vulnerable, so powerless, and the experience was forcing him to confront truths about himself that he had long ignored. Ethan spent most of his time alone in his penthouse, a space that once symbolized everything he thought he wanted: success, power, and status. But now, the cold, minimalist design, the expensive art on the walls, and the view of the Manhattan skyline felt empty, meaningless. For the first time, he wasn't surrounded by people who admired him for his wealth or his power. He was alone, left with only his thoughts and the realization of how much he had lost. He thought about Angela constantly, how she had made him feel alive in ways no one else ever had, how she had challenged him, seen through his facade, and made him question the shallow life he had built around winning and control. She had shown him what real love and connection could be, and he had thrown it away for the sake of his pride. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Ethan went for a walk through Central Park, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he moved through the chilly autumn air. The city moved around him, bustling with life, but Ethan felt strangely detached from it all. His mind kept circling back to Angela and everything he had learned during their time together. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized he couldn't simply win his way out of this. There was no strategy, no clever maneuver that would fix what he had broken. All he could do was be honest, vulnerable, and hope that Angela could one day forgive him. Ethan knew he had to change, not for her, but for himself. His obsession with success, his need to win at all costs, had cost him the one thing that truly mattered. Angela had opened his eyes to the emptiness of his existence, and now that he had seen it, he couldn't go back. He didn't want to go back. A week later, after much reflection and soul-searching, Ethan decided to make a final, genuine effort to reach out to Angela. He didn't want to bombard her with apologies or try to convince her of anything. He just wanted to tell her the truth about who he was, what he had learned, and how much she meant to him. If she didn't want to hear it, he would respect that, but he couldn't let things end without at least trying. He texted her, asking if they could meet, and to his surprise, Angela agreed, though her response was brief and cautious. They met at a small cafe near her apartment, a place they had visited once before, long before the truth of the bet had come to light. Angela arrived a few minutes late, her expression guarded but calm. She sat down across from Ethan, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, but also with the potential for something more. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I'm not here to try to fix things or make excuses," he began. I need you to know that I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for that. I thought I could control everything, people, relationships, even my own emotions. But I was wrong. You showed me that." Angela looked at him, her face softening just slightly. "And what are you going to do with that knowledge, Ethan?" she asked quietly. "It's not enough to just say you've changed. How do I know this isn't just another move in your game?" Ethan shook his head. "It's not a game anymore. It never was, not after I got to know you. I didn't realize how empty my life was until I met you. I don't want to go back to the person I was. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, or even at all. I just want you to know that you've changed me in ways I didn't think were possible." Angela was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. Her gaze softened, but there was still caution in her eyes. "I appreciate your honesty, Ethan, but I need time. I need to figure out if I can trust you again. This wasn't just about a bet for me. I let you in. I thought what we had was real." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand, and I'm willing to wait, for as long as it takes. I just needed you to know that you weren't just a bet. You're the most important person I've ever met." Angela looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know what's going to happen, Ethan, but I can see that you're trying. I need more time, and we'll see where things go from there." It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time, Ethan was willing to let go of control, to let things unfold naturally without trying to force an outcome. He had finally learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the only way to win was to stop playing the game. As Angela left the cafe, Ethan sat alone, feeling a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, that was okay. He was ready to let go, to allow himself to be vulnerable, and to see where this new path would take him. And maybe, just maybe, it would lead him back to her. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch this next story. It's incredibly emotional.